research on how effective fining drivers who are using their phones in their cars, how effective that continues to be, because we've seen a big drop-off, a big rise in the actual fines, but not a drop-off in the behaviour. So behaviour management, how are you going to
maybe
manage
it's all
behaviour?
a plan to have, lower speed police chases as the cycle cops pedal after the hero.
A bit of response as you'd expect from this one. Does that mean that police will fine cars and pedestrians that cross into cycle lanes? says Tosh. Well, we'll find out. What about this news then? Another bike news that came out recently. An e-bike discount initiative was launched by the Associate Minister of Transport that gives government workers up to 50% off e-bike purchases. So this is 50,000 government workers expected to be offered the deal over the next year with discounts of between $300 and $1,200. Ben Thomas, half-price e-bikes, nice for some.
Yeah, I mean, it seems an odd kind of subsidy to offer just to public service workers, presumably in Wellington, seems to be the target for it, to reduce the number of CEOs who have to stand on the number 3 to Karori or something. I think there's a bit of an equity argument there. If your policy goal is to get more people on e-bikes, I would have thought you'd subsidise all e-bikes. If your policy goal is to provide incentives to work in the civil service, then I guess you give the discount just to public servants.
Marty, what do you think? A model gesture that should be copied or a waste of taxpayers' money?
Well, I think there's a bit of take-up in the private sector too. So, well, not that I work entirely in the private sector, but my employer, Victoria University, is also offering subsidised e-bikes.
Right.
So, and that genuinely has made me stop and think, because I spend, a fair bit of money on a parking permit per year.
Yeah.
Should I ditch the parking permit and go for the e-bike instead? So, it has enabled that calculation to go on. So,
have you thought about that actually, Marty?
Yeah, but then there's me actually getting on the bike.
Yes, yeah. And also too
slight problem.
And also because you see them zip along, don't you, Ben Thomas? And they go fast, and you go, they're quite beautiful machines, but they do cost a lot of money. I mean, up to $2,000, $3,000. So maybe this is a gesture. If it actually adds to fitness, if it adds to better concentration at work, you've got your government workers having better productivity.
Well, actually, that's an interesting point about e-bikes, which is that one of my friends who bought one said that it took her quite a while to change her kind of frame for it, and stop seeing it as a form of exercise and just seeing it as a form of transport. She said, I felt kind of guilty, not pedaling and not sweating and not exerting myself to get to work. Yeah, and because we have always tended to look at cycling, as exercise and as a fitness thing, rather than just as a convenient transport thing. Whereas an e-bike, you actually don't have to work up a sweat at all.
By the way, no taxpayer money involved apparently on these 50% e-bikes. But that wider question, isn't it, Marmody, of how to get around in the future. Maybe we'll be wanting to ditch our cars a bit more and getting on bikes, who knows.
Yeah, work from home.
Yeah, work from home, that's right. Marty Stevens and Ben Thomas, fantastic. Thank you very much for being with us on Monday's panel. I'm Wallace Chapman. See you tomorrow from 3:45. See ya.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, a minute's silence, exactly a week since Whakaari White Island erupted. The families of the injured and dead are taken as close as they've been to the island since the volcano blew. And the Prime Minister says it could take a year for the WorkSafe investigation into the tragedy that's claimed 16 lives. Relieved passengers from the Ovation of the Seas arrive back in Australia. The cruise companies told them to expect a customer survey. The clock's ticking on the government's gun buyback. Owners fear they'll become criminals overnight unless the deadline is extended. And Nationals vowing to improve social housing if elected, but there is a catch. It wants more power to boot people out for bad behaviour.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. The WorkSafe investigation into the Whakaari White Island eruption is likely to take about a year, but Cabinet Ministers want work done now to identify any problems. The death toll stands at 16. 2 bodies are still to be found. 26 people remain in hospital in New Zealand and Australia, 10 in a critical condition. There are 2 investigations underway, one by police and the other by WorkSafe, as is mandatory when a fatality occurs at a workplace. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says ministers want to know if any action needs to be taken sooner.
I have asked for advice from officials to look into whether there are any gaps that need to be addressed that fall outside of a potential coronial inquiry and the WorkSafe investigation.
Jacinda Ardern says she expects that advice in the new year. Hundreds of people have joined together in Whakatane for 1 minute of silence to mark the tragic eruption exactly 1 week ago. They gathered at Te Manuka Tūtahi Marae near the waterfront to observe the silence at 11 minutes past 2. Kaumātua Joe Harawira says mana whenua have been guided by their tikanga to look after those affected by the tragedy. He says the mood inside the marae was solemn.
It's sombre. It's sombre in there, but at the same time there is relief that some of the families have had their loved ones returned to them.
Australian families caught up in the Whakaari White Island disaster have appealed for privacy. Carla Matthews and her partner Richard Elzer, who were travelling on the Ovation of the Seas cruise liner, were on the island. Ms Matthews' family says she was one of the 6 people whose bodies were recovered from the volcano by soldiers on Friday. They say there's a sense of relief she's been found as they wait for any news of Mr Elzer. Christine and Anthony Langford, confirmed as among those killed, were on the volcano with their 2 children, Winona and Jessie. The wider family says Winona is still unaccounted for, while Jessie remains in hospital. The teenage driver who killed another motorist while fleeing the police has been sentenced to 2 years and 8 months jail. The 18-year-old had earlier pleaded guilty to manslaughter and reckless driving, causing injury over the fatal crash which killed 64-year-old nurse Kenneth McCall in October. Anand Zaki was at the High Court at Christchurch this afternoon.
Name suppression for Jaden Richard Breakwell, who was 17 at the time of the crash, was lifted today. In a tearful statement, Breakwell said he was egged on by a passenger and wished no one had died. Justice Mander reduced the sentence from a starting point of 5.5 years due to his age, early guilty plea and remorse. He did not impose a minimum parole period. Ko Anand Zaki tēnei.
The Māori King's former spokesperson says he's shocked that money was fraudulently obtained to pay for a gastric bypass. Te Rangihiroa Whakaruru has pleaded guilty to 5 charges of obtaining by deception and 1 charge of supplying false or misleading information in the Auckland District Court today. The 56-year-old paid more than $27,000 for the bypass by including it in an invoice that was for the King's own legitimate health costs. King Tuheitia's former spokesperson, Tuku Morgan, was shocked to hear in court the scale of Whakaruru's actions.
It is very difficult to come to grips with the magnitude of what Rangi did and the kind of deceptive behaviour that he used when he secured the tribal funding.
Te Rangihiroa Whakaruru will be sentenced on April the 24th. The man who ran New Zealand's largest Ponzi scheme has been granted parole and will be released in February. David Ross was jailed in 2013 for 10 years after a decade-long investment scheme fell apart, leaving backers out of pocket to the tune of $100 million. The board said Ross should be given the opportunity for treatment and counselling should focus on his past manipulative behaviour and his willingness to deceive. He plans to move to a small town, living off his pension to avoid what the board describes as his former cocktail circuit lifestyle. The board said Ross, who's 69, poses a low risk of reoffending. A fire that has destroyed up to 20 structures, including houses west of Sydney, was started by a backburning operation. Fire crews lost control of the backburn to the south of the Gospers Mountain megafire yesterday afternoon. The Rural Fire Service Commissioner, Shane Fitzsimmons, says they were trying to protect communities, but unfortunately things don't always go to plan. In Western Australia, firefighters hope a slight drop in temperature will help them get on top of an out-of-control bushfire burning north of Perth. 9 people are being taken to Christchurch Hospital after a crash near Rolleston this afternoon. The crash happened on State Highway 1 shortly before 3:30. The road has reopened, but motorists are being warned to expect delays. It's 5 minutes past 5. New Zealand cricket great Glenn Turner says it's time to review the use of intimidatory short-pitched bowling. Australia completed a 296-run win over the Black Caps in the first test in Perth, with both teams resorting to plenty of short-pitched bowling. Comparisons are being made with the infamous 1932-33 Ashes series, where England captain Douglas Jardine introduced the bodyline tactic. Turner, a former New Zealand captain and opening batsman, isn't a fan of the approach, which was also used to good effect by the great West Indies teams of the 1970s and 80s.
It was very hard to beat them because they were bowling only about 70-odd overs a day, rotating their 4 quicks. By bowling a lot of short stuff didn't leave oppositions with an equal opportunity, let me say. So I think short, fast pitch bowling is part of the game, but if it's overdone, I don't think it helps the game.
Meanwhile, fast bowler Lockie Ferguson is coming home after his test debut was cut short by a calf injury. A replacement will be named tomorrow. Coach Gary Stead says Trent Boult, who missed the first test due to injury, will be available for the Boxing Day test in Melbourne. Manchester City have pushed Arsenal into further crisis with an embarrassing 3-0 win in their latest English Premier League football match. It means Arsenal's caretaking manager, Freddie Ljungberg, has won just one of his 5 games in charge after stepping in following the sacking of Unai Emery. City remain 14 points behind leaders Liverpool, while in other matches Tottenham beat Wolves 2-1 and Manchester United and Everton drew 1-1. That's the news.
A daring recovery on Whakaari, White Island.
The ash created what was a very sticky sort of mud, so you can imagine at times wading through an area up to sort of knee deep.
Police returned to the scene.
So they'll be back in the water tomorrow, but we will continue today with an aerial search using the Police Eagle helicopter.
And on the west coast, a woman swept kilometres out to sea.
She said, I've just been washed up. An absolute miracle. I mean, we wouldn't swim on the West Coast beaches here.
Stories as they happen. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow, from Northland to Taranaki and Taihape, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne Ranges. Scattered showers today, some possibly heavy and thundery. Rain spreading east tomorrow, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms and hail. For the remainder of the North Island, a few showers, some heavy. Periods of rain tomorrow, but only brief falls for Wairatapa, Hawke's Bay and Gisborne. Marlborough, Nelson and Buller, showers turning to rain tonight with heavy falls. Westland, rain spreading south tonight, Canterbury and central and North Otago, cloud increasing. Isolated showers turning to occasional rain this evening. Rain becoming persistent tomorrow with heavy falls. Dunedin, Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, scattered rain developing tonight, clearing Fiordland tomorrow morning and easing to isolated showers elsewhere later in the day. Chatham Islands, drizzle developing tonight, late rain tomorrow. RNZ National. It's coming up to 8.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. A workplace health and safety investigation into the Whakaari White Island eruption, which has killed 16 and left 26 others in hospital, could take a year to complete. Speaking a short time ago, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said questions needed to be asked and questions needed to be answered. She said all businesses had a primary duty of care and the investigation would need to look at the role of the tour company and the cruise company, among others. It comes as hundreds of people observed 1 minute of silence in Whakatane this afternoon to mark exactly 1 week since the Whakaari White Island disaster. 14 people remain in hospital around New Zealand. 10 of them are in a critical condition. 13 patients have been transported to Australia for treatment, although 1 has since died. 16 people in total were killed and 2 remain missing. And as our reporter Andrew McRae reports, locals gathered at Te Manuka Tutahi Marae near the waterfront at 2:11 p.m, with the volcanic island off in the distance to pay tribute to those injured and lost.
People from all walks of life took up the Marae's invitation to join together in honouring those killed in the eruption and those still in hospitals both here and in Australia. Kaumatua Joe Harawira says they've been guided by the tikanga.
With our community and has asked us to to look after our bereaved families in the best way that we can, and to umbrella the whole of the community at this tragic time for us.
There was standing room only as people also stood outside the wharenui.
And so they've got the call, they've felt within their hearts that they want to be a part of the ceremony, a part of the protocols, and it is appropriate that we have held it at our wharenui mataatua.
Mr Harawira described the atmosphere inside the wharenui as sombre, but with a sense of relief.
That some of the families have had their loved ones returned to them, and we work in two paradigms in Te Ao Māori. We work in a spiritual paradigm and we work in a physical paradigm. And so we've had in there waiata that are quite sad, have a sad tenor to them, but also we've been singing songs that will uplift the spirit of the people that are in there.
Judy Turner is the Mayor of Whakatane District. She described the feeling on the marae as calm.
And so I think there's a sense now where we are kind of, even as a district, accepting what's happened and starting to, over the next week or so, look to how do we recover as a district. But our focus is largely on those affected, you know, which includes local families, of course.
For the town and its mayor, the last 7 days has been a real roller coaster.
Do you think this has been the worst week in memory for your district?
I've been here 42 years and I'd pretty much put it at that. I mean, we've had other disasters. We had a huge flood where we evacuated a whole town only just a couple of years ago, and that was traumatic for people at the time, carrying people out at their homes and putting them on boats in the street. But yeah, the loss of life in this is horrendous, and that's what's quite different to anything else we've been through in my time here.
Judy Turner says the district is currently in a response phase and will shortly move into recovery. In Whakatane for Checkpoint, ko Andrew McRae tēnei.
And Andrew McRae is in Whakatane and joins me now. Andrew, what happened on the HMNZS Wellington today?
Good evening, Lisa. Well, this afternoon, just around about 12:30, a group of whānau were taken out by the Navy to be close to White Island at the time of the 1 minute silence. They weren't on the HMNZS Wellington. They went out on a smaller boat from the harbour here and were taken out to near the island, and they were joined by the Wellington and also the police launch Deodar. And apparently they got reasonably close to Whakaari, around about within 1 nautical mile. And when they were out there, and it was apparently quite a swell and quite rough, they were able to have that minute silence and also to throw a wreath into the water, so they were close to their loved ones.
Today, the Prime Minister announced a fund to help businesses. Now, what's the reaction been down there?
Well, I think most of them are just hearing that news now, but I would think that they would be quite pleased because a lot of these businesses, some are directly involved with tourism, some directly with White Island itself, but others the wider tourism in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. But there's all those other businesses such as restaurants and grocery stores and petrol stations, that sort of thing, who then get the flow and effect from tourists coming to this area. So I think any assistance that the government can give them will be gratefully accepted.
And what are we expecting to happen tomorrow?
Well, police are saying that, weather permitting, they will return to the area of White Island tomorrow, particularly with divers, because they're pretty sure that the 2 missing bodies are in the ocean now. So divers, Navy and police divers will return, and there's a possibility, they haven't said this yet, but there's a possibility they may also go back on the land for just one more search between the ravine and or down the ravine between the Crater Lake and the wharf. And we do know that the seismic conditions on White Island are much lower than they were, say, this time last week, obviously. So it's probably a good time to go. That's particularly as long as the weather is good for tomorrow. It was a bit rough and visibility was pretty poor out there today. And police are working on that plan to go out tomorrow, but a final decision will be made early in the morning.
Thanks, Andrew. That's Andrew McRae, our reporter on the ground there in Whakatane. It is almost 15 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback, you can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Most people severely burned in the Whakaari White Island tragedy don't know yet what has happened to them. A week on, 14 patients remain in burns units around the country, 8 of them in Middlemore. Plastic surgery consultant Michelle Locke says there is many weeks of work ahead.
The first time that a patient with burns goes to theatre, it is to clean them, to assess the limit of their burns, and certainly to start removing the burn wound. We call that debridement. And so to start with, the surgeries are to debride them and remove any of the burnt tissue. And then the rest of their surgeries after that are to reconstruct them and to perform skin grafting to reconstruct their skin. But some of the challenges we have with the major burns is that they don't have enough unburnt skin for us to graft them straight away. So you can take the amount of unburnt skin and place it in an area of their body, but there'll be large areas that we can't graft straight away. And so we have to use dressing products or, in many cases, cadaver skin to cover those areas. You may have heard that we've ordered in millions of dollars worth of cadaver skin from overseas, and that's why, because we need it for the major burns where we can't cover them with their own skin in the first instance.
So is that a temporary measure, and how long can you do that for?
Yes, so the cadaver skin is only temporary because it's not matched to the patient. So in the same way you couldn't do an organ donation to someone who wasn't matched to you, you can't put someone else's skin on it and leave it on forever. But in the burn situation, we use that cadaver skin almost as a biological dressing, and it usually will stay in place for up to 2 weeks. And it keeps that area dressed and healthy. And then we would remove it, and if we needed to, replace it with fresh cadaver skin. Or if they've got areas of unburnt skin that have healed, we can harvest the skin from that again and do some more grafting.
How long does it take your own skin to grow?
Where we harvest the skin from, we would call it the donor site, that area takes about 10 days to 2 weeks to heal up. And it would be quite normal in a major burn for us to harvest that area multiple times and let it heal and then harvest it again, let it heal, harvest it again.
So in terms of the patients that you're dealing with, will some of them have been in theatre every single day?
Probably not every single day. It would be more normal for people to come back perhaps every other day. So there are a couple of the larger burns that have been most days, but what we'll often do is spend the whole day on one person in the theatre, do as much work with them as we can, do as much grafting as we can, dress them well, and then it may be 2, 3, 4 days before they need to come back again.
So when you
But the amount of hours they spend in theatre, each time can be the whole day just on one patient.
So what do you mean by the whole day? 8 hours, 10 hours?
It takes as long as it takes, Lisa.
So hours and hours.
Many hours. So our normal operating day would be 8:30 in the morning to 4:30 at night, but with these sorts of cases, our theatres have routinely been running late, and we've often been operating till 9, 10 or 11 o'clock at night.
So obviously your skin normally, it regulates your temperature. You know, we sweat and you cool yourself and it helps warm us. How do you deal with that in a patient who has lost so much skin that the body's not able to regulate itself? Are they in warm temperatures at the hospital, or how does it work?
That's a great question, Lisa. Yes, they are kept very warm. The rooms are kept warm, and particularly the operating room, because when we take them to the operating theatre and take their dressings off, it does expose them and they can't regulate their temperature. So the operating theatre is routinely kept at around 32 degrees. So that way the patient doesn't cool down so much while we're doing their surgery and their dressing changes.
So you're in all your surgical gear. Sorry to interrupt. You're in all your surgical gear in the 32 degrees operating theatre. You would be sort of gowned up with all your gloves, etc. on during that time.
That's correct. So I'll be wearing scrubs, and then we'd have impervious gowns, gloves, hats, masks over the top, operating in 32 degrees. That's correct.
Are these patients well enough to realise the severity of their injuries at the moment, any of them?
Most of them are not. Of the 8 burns that we have at Middlemore, 5 of them are still in a critical condition. Many of them are still intubated and ventilated in our intensive care unit. So at the moment, many of them have not yet woken up.
Also, exposed areas of your body, like your hands, obviously, with, fingers are very intricate and they're moving parts of the body. Is that a specialist area, or how do you deal with things like hands?
Yes, our burn surgeons are trained to deal with all areas of the body, but certainly areas like the hands and the face we consider to be special areas, and it may be that we do the grafting slightly differently in those areas. We would put a sheet graft on where you just lay on the sheet of skin rather than meshing the skin to try and spread it and cover more area, so that we get a better cosmetic result as well from those areas. But our burn surgeons are trained in dealing with all of those special areas regardless of the type of burn injury.
And so in between those surgeries, how are they cared for? Because I'm imagining, well, you want to stop the skin tightening or drying out, or?
Yes, so that's what the dressings do. So each of the burnt areas are dressed with multiple layers of dressings. There's some dressings with, for example, like a paraffin oil beside the skin so that the skin doesn't dry out, and then layers of wet dressings that may have antibiotics or antimicrobials in them, and then drier dressings with padding to absorb any fluid that comes out of them. So when we're putting dressings on, they're usually multiple layers of different types of dressing, and that's what we use to keep the wounds moist and to absorb any fluid coming from them in between dressing changes.
And how often would the dressings be changed?
Every 2 to 3 days on average, although if we've done some skin grafting, we might leave it a little longer, perhaps 4 or 5 days, to give the graft a good chance to take before we change the dressing in that area.
So this is all incredibly labour-intensive, delicate work then?
You're absolutely right. So it is a lot of hard work, and when we have been running our burns theatres, we've been trying to staff each theatre with 4 doctors, which might be 2 consultant burn surgeons or plastic surgeons and 2 of our registrars or junior doctors helping out. And so you can imagine the amount of work we have to run those theatres, 4 theatres a day, because as well as the doctors, there's the same number of nursing staff in there. There might be 2 anaesthetists and an anaesthetic tech for every burns theatre that we run. So the amount of staff just in one burns theatre is really incredible. And then there's the workload on the ward, looking after the patients between their theatre times in our intensive care unit and the National Burns Unit. The nursing staff do an incredible job looking after them there, but it's very labour intensive.
And can family visit them on the wards?
Yes, we welcome family visitors.
I'm just more meaning in terms of infection and exposure to other people. Just wondering how that works.
So the National Burns Centre has individual rooms with, we call it an antechamber, which is a room that you go into so that they're all appropriately air pressured to prevent infections, and we ask any visitors to cover up. We have gowns and gloves that we expect people to put on before they go into the room. So we do try and prevent infection in that way, but yes, visitors can come.
So tell me, are these burns materially different to, say, a burn someone would suffer in a fire? Do they look different? Do they react different?
Yes, so some of the patients have had quite different burns because the burn has been, in some cases, more of a chemical burn, a hydrofluoric acid, for example, burn. They've also had inhalational injuries because the patients have inhaled toxic gas from the volcano, so they've got injuries to their lungs and their airways as well. They're a bit different than we've seen before. And a lot of the burns are really very deep.
How do you treat organ burns or internal burns?
We support the patients until their burns heal.
So do you mean in terms of their breathing and breathing
Yes.
assistance?
Absolutely. So
and then does the body heal itself inside?
Yes. Although obviously when you get bad injuries to the lungs and the airways, sometimes those are fatal. That's a part of the burn injury that can be a bit unpredictable.
And that's plastic surgery consultant Michelle Locke speaking there. And later this hour, we'll have more on White Island and one of the first memorial services for some of the Australian victims. The National Party is promising to be a government of infrastructure if voted in next year. Improving social housing and giving the country's roads a major funding boost are among the proposals in its latest discussion documents. It's also floating the idea of a rent-to-buy scheme for reliable state housing tenants. However, with the carrot comes the stick. National's proposing powers to boot out tenants if they refuse to change their antisocial behaviour. Here's political reporter Charlie Drever.
The proposed policies are a mix of old and new. National's long opposed the Auckland regional fuel tax, so it would scrap that and stop any further fuel taxes in a first term of government. National's transport spokesperson Chris Bishop says those taxes will be replaced with a revenue-neutral congestion charge in major cities.
We think it makes sense to look at this for New Zealand. It costs the same to drive on the road at 7 o'clock in the morning when everyone wants to use the road than it does at midnight when no one wants to use the road. And we think that congestion pricing is a way of managing demand and encouraging alternatives.
He says they'll also be giving roading a major funding boost.
The document we're launching today signals we will bring back the roads of national significance. We will also introduce a new type of road called roads of regional significance. These will be local roads which attract a higher central government funding rate on the grounds of connectivity, resilience or safety.
To help cut red tape in the construction industry, National also wants to replace the Resource Management Act completely. National's Judith Collins says both Labour and National agree the current law is underperforming. She says a National-led government would replace the RMA with transitional legislation, while it worked towards getting a new development-friendly law in place.
We need to actually sort this out, and we need to be brave enough to do it. And while peace has broken out, I'm going to take that opportunity.
For social housing, National intends to explore what it calls remind, remedy, remove. Under the system, a housing provider would give a warning when poor behaviour is detected and assistance to fix the problem. Those who refuse should be kicked out, according to National. Last month, there were up to 14,000 people on the state housing list. Simon Bridges says there are thousands of families who should have that housing.
They are good people that deserve the chance, but actually where there's people in houses who are intimidating, who are peddling drugs, and they won't change their ways, actually I'd say get those deserving families in who deserve that chance of state or social housing.
Child Poverty Action Group's Georgie Craw says the idea lacks common sense and compassion.
On the one hand, in the document, they're talking about the need to address homelessness, and on the other hand, they're proposing a system where the government would actively be contributing to making people homeless, so they contradict themselves. What we're saying is we need more support for people with very complex needs.
Georgie Craw says the document isn't clear where those people would go, but she does support the prospect of a rent-to-buy scheme for reliable tenants.
A rent-to-buy scheme is good in principle and we would agree with it, but we also say in the same breath that we need many more affordable housing options, including thousands more state homes.
The government is currently in the process of putting its own progressive home ownership paper to Cabinet, which could include a rent-to-own scheme. But whether any of National's ideas come to fruition depends on feedback from the public and then, of course, the polling booth. From Parliament, for Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
And coming up up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the Māori King's former spokesperson, Tuku Morgan, says he's shocked at how much money was fraudulently taken from the kingitanga, some of which was used for gastric bypass surgery. Parts of Australia prepare for temperatures of 40-plus degrees this week, and semi-automatic firearms owners have until midnight Friday to hand in their guns. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program so far this evening. Don't forget, you can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time now for the 5:30 headlines with Susanna.
A WorkSafe investigation into last week's Whakaari White Island eruption is likely to take a year, but the Prime Minister says she has asked officials to find out if there are any gaps which fall outside the coronial and WorkSafe inquiries, so action can be taken now. Hundreds of people stood for a minute of silence at Te Manuka Tūtahi Marae in Whakatane this afternoon to mark 1 week since the tragedy. The death toll from the volcanic eruption now stands at 16, with 2 bodies still missing. Another 26 people are in hospital, 10 of them in a critical condition. Gun Control New Zealand is rejecting claims that owners are confused about whether their weapons are banned just 4 days from the end of the amnesty. The Council of Licensed Firearms Owners estimates 70% of semi-automatic guns are still in circulation because owners are not sure if their weapons are banned. But a gun control spokesperson says this is just fear-mongering, saying it is easy to get a list and it's the owner's responsibility to find out if it applies to them. A teenage driver who killed another motorist while fleeing the police has been sentenced to 2 years and 8 months jail at the High Court in Christchurch. The 18-year-old had earlier pleaded guilty to manslaughter and reckless driving causing injury. Fraudster David Ross has been granted parole and will be released in February. Ross was jailed for 10 years in 2013 after the country's biggest Ponzi scheme fell apart, leaving his backers $100 million in the red. The 69-year-old plans to move to a small town and live off his pension. 9 people have been taken to Christchurch Hospital after a crash on State Highway 1 near Rolleston this afternoon. The road has reopened, but motorists are being warned to expect delays. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. And it's time for business news now with Nona Peltier. Nona, the government is going to release some temporary radio spectrum. Now, this is to support the national rollout of 5G, but some people think it may not be in the best interests of the consumers?
It's because it's temporary. So let's say you just built some temporary housing for yourself and then, furnished it with custom furniture. And you put it on a block, say this block, that block, whichever one. And then in 2 years from now, you're told you're going to have to bid for a more permanent location. So you get a different block, but now your couch doesn't fit. So you need to build a new one. So that's kind of an analogy. But You're basically talking about a lot of money to build a 5G network. And you're building it for a piece of spectrum, which you're only going to have temporarily and only for 2 years. And then you're going to have to rebid for another piece of spectrum, which you'll have for a longer term. And it's a complicated reason for this. But basically, whichever which way you look at it, it's going to be the consumer who pays for all of this. Because at the end of the day, it's not the companies who benefit from this that are going to cover the cost. They're going to just pass it on to consumers. And the government, it also gets revenue because they auction the spectrum. They're going to auction it twice. They're going to auction it in this temporary step, and then they're going to auction it again. So the only real winners in this are probably the government and the telecommunication companies, but not the users. And so it remains to be seen even whether or not anyone other than Spark is going to bid for this. So there's a lot of fishhooks in it, and it's a complicated thing. And I spoke with the head of the Telecommunication Users Association, otherwise known as TUANS, Craig Young. And he says, look, it's a temporary solution. It's not the best solution. And here's what he had to say.
So the telcos themselves are in favour because it gets them spectrum earlier, because the government hasn't set their long-term position. But our view is that we would rather that they did the long-term now. It shouldn't be too hard. They should be able to work it out quite quickly, how to do it, who to give it to, and how to make sure we have a competitive mobile network which works best for consumers.
And that's the Chief Executive of the Telecommunication Users Group, 2An's, Craig Young. Now, I spoke with Craig after I spoke with him for this interview earlier today, and I'm trying to decipher all the different statements we've had. Now, none of the telecommunications companies would agree to be interviewed by us. And there's probably a good reason for that, because two of them are not at all interested in, well, it's hard to say whether they're interested, but I can imagine they probably aren't interested in bidding for the spectrum because it's going to be expensive. But the other reason is that Vodafone already owns a part of it. That's the reason why the government can't allocate it now, because they already have sold off part of it in 2001. And that license goes for 20 years till 2022. And that's the only time when the government can actually auction it. And they've been unable to work a deal with the telecommunication companies. Vodafone most specifically has an advantage over the others. And that's one of the reasons why they're breaking this interim step to sort of level the playing field. But in the end, it doesn't make any difference. It's going to be expensive, more expensive than it should be because of this two-step process.
Okay, you've got some of the latest data that's indicating the service sector is doing it tough leading into the holidays. What are the numbers kind of telling us?
Yeah, so we had a bit of a bounce back. So services are the kinds of things we buy and consume at the spot, like service industries, like say going to the dentist or eating at a restaurant, that kind of thing. And then there's manufacturing. That's the stuff we make and export, so to speak, and the things we consume in a different way. So goods and services, right? The latest data shows that the services sector has gone backwards. And it's gone backwards to the point where it's a contraction that's a significant one over the month before. So we went to 53.3. That's a drop of 2 points. That may not seem very much, but it's really the new orders that's seen that drop. That isn't a good story, because if we're not ordering things from the services sector, that means that their economic growth could definitely be weaker than we expected. And the BNZ, who put out this index every month, says it could actually be below 2% economic growth, which is not a good number for us.
Hey, what has been going on with the rest of the markets today?
Okay, well, look, we're down slightly, just 15 points, but this is on an uncertain environment, because even though it looks like the Chinese and the United States have done a deal on trade, there's a lot of skepticism in the market in Asia Pacific. They're not exactly sure, so there's a bit of uncertainty which way things are going to go until we see the detail and the ink is dry on the paper. Anything can happen, right? Yep. So we're down 15 points to 11,227, and our dollar is steady. It dropped a little bit following Brexit on Friday, but we're back up to 65.9 US cents, 95.8 Australian, and 49.2 British pence.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with our business update. And the Māori King's former spokesperson is shocked at how much money was fraudulently taken from the kingitanga, some of which was used for gastric bypass surgery. 56-year-old Te Rangi Hiroa Whakaruru pleaded guilty to 5 charges of obtaining by deception and 1 charge of supplying false or misleading information in Auckland District Court today. One of the charges was for a gastric bypass in May 2016 that Whakaruru paid over $27,000 of using kingitanga money by including it in an invoice for the King's own legitimate health costs. King Tuhetia's former spokesperson, Tuku Morgan, told our reporter Meriana Johnson there were long-held suspicions about how the bypass was paid for. However, he says he wasn't prepared for the scale of Te Rangi Hiroa Whakaruru's fraudulent activities.
You see, that was just one of a number of examples of how money was fraudulently used. It is very difficult to come to grips with the magnitude of what Rangi did and the kind of fraud and deceptive behaviour that he used when he secured the tribal funding. We don't know how much of the money that was spent, other than the fact that it was taken, and it was fraudulently taken. I think what's important here is actually the consequential effect of what he did, because the consequential effect is something that the tribe and the kingitanga movement have to deal with right now, and that is the trampling of our mana, the loss of mana, of integrity and respect, because he was the face of the king. So he was a man in the inner sanctum who was given a whole host of responsibilities to perform. and he betrayed all of us. And that's caused huge damage, not only to the tribe's mana, but also to the mana of the King movement.
Do you feel his guilty plea goes some way to healing that betrayal?
Rangi Whakaruru has to face whatever sentence is handed down to him. That's going to be undeniable. But the damage that he has caused is huge and is of a scale yet for us all to come to grips with, because you're talking about, as I say, you're talking about a person who was the face of the king. Now, when you take that in consideration and the behaviour that he has undertaken in defrauding the tribe, that has caused huge issues for us. There will be thousands of our people across this country who would feel aggrieved that someone who had such responsibility can do what he did.
The Māori King's former spokesperson Tuku Morgan speaking to our reporter Mediana Johnson. And Te Rangihiroa Whakaruru will be sentenced on April 24th. A gun owners' rights group says law-abiding citizens will become criminals overnight unless the government extends the deadline for its gun buyback scheme. Owners of semi-automatic firearms have until midnight Friday to take their guns in and receive compensation. But as Conan Young reports, some fear owners will seek to sell them illegally if they aren't given more time.
The police say 47,000 weapons have been handed in over the past 5 months. However, because there's no record of how many semi-automatic guns are in circulation in this country, nobody knows if that is a high number or a very low one. But the Council of Licensed Firearms Owners has done its own analysis based on talking to gun dealers and looking at import data, and says 47,000 is a very low number. Spokesperson Nicole McKee estimates 70% of the banned weapons are still in circulation.
The ban actually is about all different types of actions, and there are so many people out there that do not realise that they have prohibited firearms that are not semi-automatics. What is this going to mean? We're going to have a lot of legal, law-abiding people become criminals literally overnight on Friday if they do not hand in those firearms.
Nicole McKee says the government and police needs to do a much better job on educating people on the vast number of weapons classed as being semi-automatics, as she believes many people think the ban only applies to the type of weapon said to be used by the Christchurch mosque shooter. She predicts the deadline will come and go before most realise they're suddenly holding a banned weapon.
Once people realise that they are going to go to jail for being in possession of these firearms, they won't want to be holding them. So it will be really unfortunate if these firearms end up making their way into the black market because those holding them are too scared to hand them in.
However, Gun Control New Zealand's Nick Green says that type of rhetoric is just fear-mongering. He notes the Arms Act gives police discretion over whether they lay charges when a firearm is willingly handed into them, meaning this Friday's deadline is not the last chance for owners to do the right thing. He doesn't buy the line that gun owners are confused over whether the ban applies to them.
There's a fairly lengthy list of the firearms that are prohibited. That was part of the buyback process. I mean, if you have one of these firearms and you have a licence, it's kind of your responsibility to check whether the weapon is prohibited or not.
He says the 48,000 guns handed in so far isn't a bad result.
There's been a fair amount of overblown rhetoric from the gun lobby suggesting that people are going to bury them in their backyards and things like that. I suspect some people have been motivated by a false hope that some legal challenges will force the government to change their mind, etc. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
A police spokesperson says there are a collection of events throughout the country this week. People can also hand in weapons to their local police station or organise a bulk pickup for more than 10 items. Mō te hotaka o te ahi, ko Conan Young tēnei.
The longest United Nations climate talks on record have finally ended in Madrid with a compromise deal. Exhausted delegates finally reached agreement on the key question of increasing the global response to curbing carbon. All countries will need to put new climate pledges on the table by the time of the next major conference in Glasgow next year. Divisions over other questions, including carbon markets, are all delayed until the next gathering. The BBC's David Shookman reports reports at times the negotiations tested the stamina of delegates.
We're starting to get a little lost. We are kind of lost.
Okay.
Confusion and fatigue after the longest session of climate negotiations on record.
We are a little confused about what documents are being discussed.
The hope had been to speed up the fight against rising temperatures. Instead, the talks limped to a compromise that left many unhappy, especially the island nations that fear for their futures.
I'm exhausted. I feel like much more could have been done. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to go home and explain that this was a really challenging process, especially for the island states and the developing nations.
The gases driving up temperatures are being blasted out in ever greater quantities, and the most vulnerable countries were banking on getting new promises to cut these emissions. Their worry is that a hotter world will see more melting of the ice caps and a higher sea level, threatening coastlines around the world. The whole point of these talks over the last quarter of a century has been to try to stop global temperatures from rising to dangerous levels. The world has already warmed by just over 1 degree Celsius over the last 150 years, and a rise of up to 1.5 degrees is regarded as the maximum safe limit. But even with all the pledges that countries have made on climate change, we're still heading for an increase of at least 3 degrees despite all these conferences. So what happens now? The world's biggest polluter, China, is still using coal, the dirtiest kind of fuel, and has plans to burn a lot more of it. But there are hints that next year we'll see a greener Chinese policy emerge. That would help the UK. The former Minister Claire O'Neill is now in the chair of the UN process. She'll need plenty of support ahead of the next summit due in Glasgow next November.
One of the things that this moment made more difficult for the UK is the fact that they now have a much tighter set of negotiation items that they're going to have to deal with next year. But the actual lift in terms of delivering more action was always going to be a big lift, and they can't do it on their own.
David Shookman with that report. And the bushfire crisis in New South Wales continues, with reports homes have been lost to the west of Sydney. Flames of up to 70 metres have been reported as firefighters tackle what they're calling a mega fire, tearing through farmland and bush. And with multiple fires burning close to the World Heritage Blue Mountains region, there are serious concerns about the summer months ahead.
It's been called a mega blaze, and it's been burning for weeks on the doorstep of the World Heritage Blue Mountains.
There's a house in behind there.
Yesterday afternoon, conditions deteriorated quickly.
Try and protect that house. Try and protect that house.
The Rural Fire Service issued an emergency warning, yet again, for the Gospers Mountain Fire. And there are concerns properties have been lost around Mount Tomah and Mount Wilson.
My immediate concern is obviously for that community in what we call the Mounts to the north of the Blue Mountains.
Mark Greenhill is the Mayor of the Blue Mountains.
The reports I've had, which are unconfirmed, are that it was impact those townships, and I know some of the fire units that have been out there. Knowing what I know about the terrain, I think they probably would have had a very difficult afternoon and night last night.
Given those challenges, one road in, one road out, the dense terrain, the rugged terrain, are the people who live in these communities, do you feel like they're well prepared for a situation like this?
I have to say that if you were going to talk about prepared communities, it'd be hard to go past these ones. And I must also add that emergency services have spent the last few weeks preparing in that area.
The communities are fairly isolated and away from the highly populated areas of the Blue Mountains. But the outlook is dire. The Gospers Mountain Fire has now burnt through almost 380,000 hectares, joining with others to create a blaze that stretches from Lithgow, about 150 kilometres west of Sydney, almost as far east as the state's central coast. And it's not the only fire encroaching on the region. There are 2 more just to the south. Rob Rogers is the Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service.
There's going to be a lot of work going on over the next 24 hours to try and just see what we can do to protect as many properties as we can, but people should be under no illusions. We're not going to get this fire put out, and we're going to have to get through this next week of really hot weather with these fires being very active.
For Mark Greenhill, there's a tough time ahead.
Frankly, fires on multiple sides is rather unprecedented. The bush, the condition of the bush, and some may not like it, but I'm going to say it, the condition of the climate that we're experiencing now, all unprecedented. I believe we have weeks ahead of us of difficult times, I'm sorry to say.
And that was Mark Greenhill, the Mayor of the Blue Mountains, ending that report. Police have clashed with demonstrators in parts of the Indian capital, Delhi, during protests over a controversial new law on migrants. The new law entitles non-Muslim migrants from 3 Muslim-majority countries to citizenship if they're facing religious persecution. Protests have raged across North and East India since the law was passed. The BBC's Pratikshal Gildayal reports from Delhi.
Extraordinary scenes in India's capital. This is the 5th straight day of violent protests across many parts of the country. Here, the security forces clash with students from a top university. The students claim the police violently entered the Jamia Millia Islamia University and assaulted them. The police say they were attacked with stones. The students were protesting against India's new citizenship law that allows migrants from neighbouring countries to get Indian citizenship, except if they are Muslims. It's not just Delhi that has erupted with anger. In the northeastern state of Assam, they're on the streets for different reasons. These people fear the new law will lead to them being overrun by migrants from neighbouring Bangladesh, both Hindus and Muslims. At least 2 people were killed here, reportedly in firing by security forces. 17-year-old Sam Stafford was one of them. A passionate musician, he wanted to show solidarity with his friends who were protesting against the new citizenship law. We got a call that Sam was hit by bullets, she tells me, and he died on the spot. I want justice. I want to know why he was shot. He committed no crime. Meanwhile, people are determined to show resistance, even as the authorities continue the clampdown.
And that was Pratikshal Gildayal reporting. It is about 8 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A Brisbane community has held an emotional candlelit vigil for a mother and daughter who were the first Australian victims to be named after the Whakaari eruption. Julie Richards and her 20-year-old daughter Jessica had planned to climb the volcano a few years earlier, but that tour was cancelled. Brisbane councillor Angela Owen is from the same Callum Vale community as Julie and Jessica and was at the service last evening held in the local park where the mother and daughter would often visit.
Julie and Jessica were beautiful, genuine people who in our community knew many, many people through their different avenues of sport, and also Jessica was a student at one of my local schools.
So tell us of the vigil. What was the mood like there?
It was a very dignified and respectful mood. We started off with a musical dedication which was performed by former classmates and bandmates of Jessica's and her former music teacher. Then her Australian football team teammates actually performed their club song, and this was very moving because they came together in a very big circle, and this is a very powerful and emotive song for every team, and they just sang it with such heart and such emotion, and many of them were quite distressed at the point of singing it because they knew how much it meant to Jessica to be part of that team. And also Julie, her mum, often volunteered at the club. She was always one of these people that would willingly assist in whatever role, whether it was running water up the sidelines or assisting in coordinating things to help fundraise for the team. But more importantly, they were part of that bigger team family. After that, we had a number of speeches. So two of Julie's best friends gave speeches about how they came to know each other when their children were born and how they became the village that helped Julie raise Jessica over the years. And then two of Jessica's best friends, since they were babies, also talked about how sad it is that they keep going to message Jessica to tell her different things about their day, and they know that now she'll never respond. But they took great heart in the fact that knowing that despite losing both Julie and Jessica, that they were together and will always be together. It was very emotional. We also had a speech by Julie's sister-in-law, who said that in the days prior to Julie and Jessica going on the cruise, they joined together with other family members, and it was the first time in a long time that Julie and her other three siblings were together. And there was a beautiful photo that was taken of the four siblings together on that day where they were celebrating Julie's mother's 85th birthday. The other thing that was also highlighted was that Julie and Jessica were, as it was coined the phrase, they were jumping out of their skin with excitement to be able to go on this cruise, to be able to actually go to Whakaari and to explore that adventure together.
Had they planned, Angela, I'd heard they had planned to come earlier, but it just didn't work out?
It didn't work out the previous time, so that they were so keen to actually visit this and go on this adventure together, and they were so looking forward to it, which is really, it's just so ironic in this situation that they got to do what they really wanted to do in their hearts, and they were together doing it. After the speeches ended, we had Wayne Moses, who is a Ngāti Awa iwi leader. He's a tribal leader, a tribal elder and spiritual leader, do an acknowledgement, and he also spoke about the Ngāti Awa iwi, saying that the axe never weakens in the sun, it never loosens in the rain. In times of adversity, we should stay strong, and that your grief is our grief and we share our sorrow. And the Māori community here, they sung the Lord's Prayer in Māori and also performed the haka, and it was so emotional but also so uniting for not just the community here who has lost two of our beautiful members, but also for everyone to share in grief and join each other in this time of sorrow, to show that we are there to support each other, whether it is here in our local community in Brisbane or in Australia, but also between Australia and New Zealand. Then we had an opportunity for people to lay floral tributes, and then we lit candles and had 2-minute silence to reflect and remember the lives of Julie and Jessica Richards, but also all of the victims of the circumstances that happened in Whakaari, and also to pay tribute to all of the first responders and all of the people who are assisting at this very, very difficult time.
It must be a very hard thing to reconcile. So many Australians nip across to New Zealand for a holiday. Hundreds of thousands would have been before, and for this terrible outcome, it must be so hard to reconcile that.
It is very, very difficult. Brisbane and Auckland are sister cities, so we have a very strong affinity between Australia and New Zealand, and of course the circumstances of the Anzacs. The bonds are very, very strong, and I myself have been to New Zealand a number of times, and it is not the sort of thing that you expect to have happen, but I think everybody reflects that with natural circumstances, natural disasters, we need to be there to support each other, and that is what the community is certainly doing.
Are they asking many questions? Are there questions that they have that are unanswered about the circumstances?
I think a lot of the people here accept that going to a volcano is very much a natural state. It is a natural place. There will always be questions, but I think the support that the community is giving one another and that is receiving from the New Zealand community, we're just working through it.
And that was Brisbane Councillor Angela Owen. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National, and after 6 we'll have more on White Island and the government considering law changes to adventure tourism. A lot of you getting in touch about Michelle Locke, the plastic surgeon, saying she's a wonderful, open and honest, talented professional.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata tēnei. Many of the victims of last week's Whakaari White Island eruption still haven't woken up. 14 patients remain in burns units around the country, 8 of them in South Auckland's Middlemore Hospital. Checkpoint asked plastic surgery consultant Michelle Locke whether the patients were aware of the extent of their injuries.
Most of them are not. Of the 8 burns that we have at Middlemore, 5 of them are still in a critical condition. Many of them are still intubated and ventilated in our intensive care unit. So at the moment, many of them have not yet woken up.
Plastic surgery consultant Michelle Locke. The WorkSafe investigation into the eruption is likely to take about a year, but Cabinet Ministers want work done now to identify any problems. 2 investigations are underway, one by police and the other by WorkSafe, as is mandatory when a fatality occurs at a workplace. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says ministers want to know if any action needs to be taken sooner. She expects to get the advice in the new year. Cabinet has also approved a $5 million fund for the impact of the Whakaari eruption and recent wild weather in Westland. The Prime Minister says the focus of the fund will be to provide support to small businesses which are reliant on tourism, but she wouldn't confirm whether any of the funds could go to the White Island tour operators.
We haven't concluded the establishment of the criteria. What we are acknowledging is that there is likely to be wider impacts, but keeping in mind, obviously, there are a number of employees who have been affected and will be affected by what has happened on Whakaari White Island.
Jacinda Ardern says a delegated group of ministers will work through this criteria and administration of the fund over the summer period. A kaumātua at Te Manuka Tūtahi Marae in Whakatāne says there was a sombre but uplifting mood at a ceremony to mark the tragic events 1 week ago. Joe Harawira says 250 people from all walks of life gathered at the marae for 1 minute silence at 2:11, exactly a week since the eruption. He says mana whenua have been guided by tikanga to look after those affected by the tragedy. Delegates and activists have criticised the compromise reached at the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, accusing major polluters like the US and Brazil of blocking stronger action. 2 weeks of talks agreed only that wealthier nations would come up with more ambitious plans to cut emissions by the end of next year. The BBC's David Chuckman reports.
Terribly sorry, Madam President, we can't find the document.
We are kind of lost.
Okay.
Confusion and fatigue among delegates in the final hours of a marathon set of talks. Some arguments were technical over how to account for carbon emissions, which proved so difficult they were put off to next year. Other disputes were more fundamental over commitments for deeper cuts in emissions, as demanded by the latest science, but resisted by some of the biggest polluters.
David Chuckman reporting. A gun control group is rejecting claims gun owners are confused about whether their weapons are banned. With the amnesty finishing at midnight on Friday, the Council of Licensed Firearms Owners estimates 70% of semi-automatic guns are still in circulation. It says this is because owners are unsure if their weapons are banned. However, Gun Control New Zealand spokesperson Nick Green says that's just fear-mongering.
There's a fairly lengthy list of the firearms that are prohibited. That was part of the buyback process. I mean, if you have one of these firearms, and you have a licence, it's kind of your responsibility to check whether the weapon is prohibited or not.
Nick Green says those who miss the deadline will still be able to hand in their weapons, with the police having discretion over whether to lay charges. A Māori performing arts educator has pleaded guilty to defrauding a whare wānanga and the Tertiary Education Commission of more than $1 million. 61-year-old Donna Mariana Grant pleaded guilty to 3 charges of dishonesty using documents and a single charge of obtaining by deception at the High Court in Rotorua today. She fraudulently obtained about $1.25 million from Te Whare Wānanga o Awanuiarangi and the Tertiary Education Commission. Mrs Grant has been remanded on bail and will reappear for sentencing on February the 7th. The Prime Minister has downplayed an old tweet in which he described Boris Johnson as a gaff man and questioned the likelihood of him ever leading the United Kingdom. The tweet from 7 years ago came to light following Mr Johnson's commanding re-election victory last week. Speaking to reporters, Jacinda Ardern says she imagines the British Prime Minister would have a laugh over it. She says Jacinda Ardern has sent a congratulatory text and expects to speak to Mr Johnson over the phone in the near future. It's 5 minutes past 6. The Australian cricket captain Tim Paine is predicting a bodyline approach for the rest of the Test series against New Zealand. Australia completed a comprehensive 296-run win inside 4 days in the first Test in Perth last night. The match featured a barrage of short pitch bowling, with the Black Caps setting fields for leg side catches both behind the wicket and for the pull shot, reminiscent of the infamous 1932-33 Ashes series when England introduced the bodyline tactic. Despite that, Payne says the match was played in good spirit.
When you have your attack, you have what you have, and unfortunately I can't promise you that I can pluck out guys that can bowl 150 from New Zealand and bring them over here, because I'm not sure we necessarily have them. Is it bodyline? I don't know. I mean, I think it's part of the game, and bounce is a legitimate delivery.
Tim Paine. Baseball legend Babe Ruth may have died more than 70 years ago, but the slugger is still turning out big numbers. The bat he used to hit his 500th home run in 1929 has sold for $1.5 million at auction in California. The British boxer Tyson Fury has split with trainer Ben Davison and teamed up with Javen Sugar Hill 2 months before his February match with WBC heavyweight champion Deontay Wilder. Davison and Fury have worked together since 2017. Fury and Wilder will face each other in a highly anticipated rematch in Las Vegas in February. The Tall Blacks will play Australia in the first game of the Asia Cup basketball qualifiers in Brisbane in February. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Peter Lamp rates Ian Foster's prospects as an All Black coach, the vets who are volunteering to work on Niue, and we've got a sofa session with the Taranaki band Oh Juliet.
Let us settle, just be careful.
That's Nights, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. From Northland to Taranaki and Taihape, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne ranges. Scattered showers tonight, some possibly heavy and thundery. Rain spreading east tomorrow, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms and hail. For the remainder of the North Island, a few showers, some heavy tonight, periods of rain tomorrow, but only brief falls for Wairatapa, Hawke's Bay and Gisborne. For Marlborough, Nelson and Buller, showers turning to rain tonight with heavy falls. Westland, rain spreading south tonight. Canterbury and Central and North Otago, cloud increasing. Isolated showers turning to occasional rain this evening. Rain becoming persistent tomorrow with heavy falls. Dunedin, Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, scattered rain developing tonight, clearing Fiordland tomorrow morning and easing to isolated showers elsewhere later in the day. Chatham Islands, drizzle developing this evening, late rain tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Cabinet is not prepared to wait until WorkSafe and coroners have finished their investigations into the Whakaari White Island explosion before considering any necessary law changes and wants official advice in the new year. At today's Cabinet meeting, ministers had to consider whether anything needed to be done on top of the 2 investigations already underway. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern told reporters at Parliament the WorkSafe investigation is likely to take about a year, and so officials have been asked to provide advice early next year if they identify any broader issues. The role of WorkSafe itself as the primary regulator could also come under scrutiny, potentially through a coronial inquest. Ms Ardern says while the current inquiries would be thorough, ministers want to make sure there are no gaps in the system.
Having looked at a number of accidents, significant events in recent years in New Zealand, they've often been investigated by, for instance, the Department of Labour, coronial inquests. They haven't always had then separate inquiries. What I want to make sure is that we answer all of the questions we need to answer, that we don't duplicate, and importantly, we don't get in the way of what WorkSafe needs to do as part of their job.
Workplace health and safety laws and regulations for adventure tourism have been updated over the years in response to past tragedies. Tour operators like White Island Tours work under 2016 regulations that require them to undergo a safety audit and register with WorkSafe. WorkSafe has a year in which to pursue any charges as a result of its inquiry. Ms Ardern says there are also the coronial investigations.
It's up to the coroner as to whether or not they undertake the nature of their investigatory work. That is a matter for them. And for us, as I said, I expect to get some more formal advice in the new year around any potential gaps that we might need to fill.
The Australian Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, has also arrived in Wellington today to express her country's thanks to New Zealand for its response to the Whakaari White Island tragedy and to express her sincere condolences. She's meeting with Ms Ardern and the Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters, about now, and Ms Payne is in New Zealand until Wednesday. Over the next few days, she'll meet with Australian Foreign Affairs and police staff helping with the response here on the ground. Meanwhile, an Australian on board the cruise ship Ovation of the Seas says the cruise company's told her she'll get a customer survey about the trip and a refund of about $135 for the extra day the ship had to stay in port after the volcanic eruption. 38 passengers from the cruise liner were on Whakaari White Island when it blew a week ago today. The death toll from the eruption stands at 16. Vanessa Lugo, who didn't take the volcano tour partly because she's asthmatic, says she's relieved the cruise is over and she is finally home.
We had just come back from the Rotorua Thermal Springs and we just got in, we were just settling down, getting ready for our afternoon back on the boat, and all of a sudden we heard, actually my friend came into the room and he said there's been a volcano that's been erupted, and at the time I was kind of like, oh, look, volcanoes happen in New Zealand, it's quite normal. And then he's like, no, there was people from our ship that had gone to the island to walk around it, and I was horrified. And pretty much a couple of seconds later, we get an announcement into all of the rooms, and that's when you know something major's happened. And the captain, you could hear in his voice, he was quite upset. He was distressed about the information he was just about to provide us, saying that there was members of passengers as well as crew that are currently missing. Already one had been confirmed dead. And it was, at the time, you just stood in shock. You just couldn't believe what was actually happening. And then from there, we turned on the news and we saw everything. And it was crazy. It was like, surely this is not happening right now. Because we were saying that nothing's really happened in New Zealand for quite a while now, for a few years. So we're like, surely everything will be fine. So yeah, it was just quite crazy that it was all happening while we were there.
So you chose to go on a different outing. Did you consider going to the volcano at any point?
Oh, yeah, 100% we did, because a lot of time we get given a list of options before we actually go on the cruise. So months ahead, people look at the different options that are provided. So at the time we saw, like, White Island Volcano Walk, and we said, wow, that would be amazing. The only things that kind of threw us off going on it was the price of it. I think it was like $554 for an adult. And then also it was quite a strenuous activity. So I have asthma. So them saying that we had to wear the gas mask, it was kind of like, oh, am I going to be okay? Or is that a bit too risky with my lungs being the way they are? So at the moment, I'm super glad, because I know for a fact I wouldn't have been able to deal with that sulfate and everything that they were inhaling.
Do you recall when you looked at the options for the different tours, when it came to White Island, whether there was any information about it being an active volcano?
Yeah, so pretty much the first sentence said that it was an active volcano, but it was one of those things where it just kept going on saying about everything that you got to do on the island. So I guess as a tourist, you kind of look at it and think, oh, well, they wouldn't have made the island available to anyone at all if it was dangerous to anyone. They didn't say anything that it was going to erupt or there was chances of it erupting. It just said, look, it was an old volcano. It's been active for many years, but nothing else. So that's why, as a tourist, you just think, oh, it's something fun and crazy, and who would ever do something like this? So, of course, people are going to be super excited to do an adventure like that. So, yeah, no chance at all that we ever thought to have a look and see whether or not it was going to erupt or the levels. We had no idea that information was actually available either.
So that was through actually the cruise company, was it, that you considered all your different options of tours? That was through the cruise company?
Yeah, so with the cruise, apparently they had third-party companies from New Zealand, I guess, that are linked with Royal Caribbean that work together. And at the time, I thought that was the only kind of tours you could do. It wasn't until I had spoken with other passengers and they said, oh, no, you can actually do tours throughout New Zealand that isn't with Royal Caribbean and the people that are sponsored with them. So that was something new information for us because that's not really specified, I guess, when you book the trip. So, we only knew about what was actually included with Royal Caribbean.
So how much information did the cruise company give you after the volcano erupted? Were you given regular updates? How do you feel about the information you were given?
Well, honestly, at the time, I thought we were getting enough information, but it wasn't until I had a lot of media people contacting me and saying, "Hey, have you heard about this? How do you feel about this?" And it was quite shocking because I actually hadn't heard any of that information yet from our captain or from any announcements. So all we were really told was that the captain would give us information once the government and police officials had provided him information. So, I guess a lot of us weren't sure whether if the captain was being delayed in being provided information or if it was just the media getting everything way quicker. But, yeah, we definitely weren't being kept on the same level as we thought we would have been.
And in the days after the eruption, how did the rest of the cruise go?
It was hard. A lot of people ask me now and they said, oh, did you enjoy the rest of the trip? And it's just one of those things where it's just like, how can I enjoy the rest of the trip knowing that fellow people that I may have met are not going back home or enjoying this trip or anything like that? So, sorry, I'm getting emotional now. It's quite hard. A lot of people were very upset. And it was one of those things that's like, yes, we can try and continue to have a good time, but we all knew in the back of our stomachs, we're like, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right to continue doing this all, knowing that people were still missing or people were still in hospital.
Did you just want the trip to be over?
100%. 100%. I just wanted to be at home with my friends and family. It was quite tough. So I know a lot of people were quite strong and they could kind of push it aside. But for a lot of us, it was quite hard to continue the trip and trying to put a smile on our face. Yeah.
Has the cruise company offered you any support?
They did offer support. They advised on the trip that they had counsellors available if anyone needed it. I heard of a couple of people going ahead and using the services, but I feel like a lot of people don't feel comfortable, I guess, talking straight away. It was quite difficult, I guess, for a lot of different people. We would have thought that maybe they would give us free internet to actually contact our friends and family to let them know we were safe, but we weren't really offered anything like that. And then really the last day we received pamphlets, which were Australian government that had written them up and saying that if they did need any support, Australians would have that support when they got back home with going to their GP and there's mental health services.
Do you actually feel, Vanessa, that it's fully hit you yet, this?
Oh, 100%. It 100% hit me pretty much straight away. I'm quite an emotional person, so if I hear about anyone else that has suffering, especially knowing that there was young children, people my age, it affects you definitely. I don't know if that's just me, but it definitely has hit me quite hard.
So is that the end of your involvement with the cruise company, or did they say that they would follow up with you after you left the cruise? Or obviously at various points the cruise changed, you were stuck in Port in Tauranga. Have they offered any compensation or given you any assurances they will follow up with you?
We haven't really been told if we'd get a follow-up at all. We were just told that we'd get a survey by email.
Excuse me, sorry, Vanessa, did you say a survey?
Yeah, a survey, yes, correct. I'm pretty much on how the trip went. So that was it. We weren't really told if they were going to follow up in regards to what ended up happening. Hopefully they do. I think a lot of us would want to know what had happened and why it all happened. But unfortunately, no, I don't know if we will know anymore. In regards to compensation, they did offer us 1 day refund for being in Tauranga for the extra day, but that was about it. So that was, I think, like $89 being refunded, and then refunding the tours that we missed in Wellington.
And that's Vanessa Lugo, who was a passenger on Ovation of the Seas, which arrived back in Sydney today. It is almost 21 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A brutal heatwave is set to hit a number of Australian states this week, with many towns preparing for 4 days of temperatures beyond the 40-degree mark. Some areas are expected to record their highest ever December temperatures. South Australia will be hardest hit, but eastern states are also bracing for an exhausting week. The ABC's David Sparks reports.
An extremely hot air mass has been building over Western Australia in recent days, and it's about to head east. The Weather Bureau's Jonathan Howe says it will hit South Australia today and tomorrow and arrive in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania in the middle of the week.
We are likely to see quite a few records broken across the different states, with some places getting up to the high 40s and possibly getting as high as 50 degrees through parts of the Nullarbor inland parts of South Australia as well.
Among the capitals, Adelaide will have the worst run.
Adelaide's going for 4 days at 40 degrees or above from Tuesday, peaking on Friday at 42 degrees. And Melbourne's going to be a little bit different story just because they're near the coast. 39 on Wednesday, cooler on Thursday, 23, but getting up to 41 on Friday. Canberra is also looking at quite a warm run with 4 days in a row at 38 or above, peaking at 43 on Saturday. And for Sydney, we're expecting to get into the mid to high 40s in the western suburbs, so 46 for the western suburbs of Sydney on Saturday.
But the worst heat will be away from the major cities. In South Australia, Renmark and Port Augusta are among several towns expected to hit 48 degrees on Friday. Across the border in northwest Victoria, Mildura and Swan Hill are both set to reach 46 degrees. Many more towns in those states and New South Wales are expecting temperatures beyond 45.
This particular event has been exacerbated by a couple of other factors. The first one is something called the Indian Ocean Dipole and just the late onset of the monsoon across northern Australia. So the monsoon is quite late this year, which does mean that it is hotter and drier than normal across northern Australia. And that has meant that the heat has really been able to build across WA and the NT and just really stagnate over the last few days and even weeks as well.
Jenny Semler is director of 919 Wines, a vineyard near Renmark in South Australia's Riverland region. She says this year's grapes, still at a very early stage, will cop a scorching when the extreme heat arrives.
So at the moment they're looking green and hard. They're like little peas in a bunch. The impact at this stage, if we get too much heat, the bunches will actually burn, and so they'll end up with quite bad scarring on them, thick, hard scars, which can impart dreadful flavours into the wine. But it will also mean that perhaps we could lose the crop. You know, prepare for the worst and hope for the best and hang on for the wild ride, basically.
And that was South Australian winemaker Jenny Semler ending that report. The Black Caps cricketers have been left with plenty to ponder after a big defeat to Australia in the first test in Perth. The Australians wrapped up a thumping 296-run win in the day-night match, giving them a 1-0 lead in the three-match series. New Zealand now head to Melbourne, needing to turn things around and win the Boxing Day test to keep their chances of winning the series alive. Sports reporter Clay Wilson spoke with former New Zealand captain and opening batsman Ken Rutherford to get his reaction to the Black Caps' performance in Perth.
There's a hint of ambush about it, isn't it, in terms of pink ball test in Perth and no warm-up games into it and losing the toss, having to go out there at the field for 10 hours and that 40-degree heat. So maybe we shouldn't be too surprised at the way we lost. I guess we are kind of surprised at the manner of the capitulation, but in terms of the lead-up, the build-up, two fairly docile pitches here in New Zealand when we played those two matches against England, the portents were probably pointing to something a bit dire. We hoped it wouldn't be, but yeah, it was really disappointing. That's the bottom line.
We saw the struggles with pace and bounce not only from our batsmen but the Australian batsmen as well. But from the perspective of our batsmen, what did you make of the struggles with particularly Stark and Cummins and those shorter, quicker deliveries?
Yeah, they're good bowlers, so it's not easy, particularly in their conditions, particularly when they're fresh and they've got a big total to bowl to. We know what they're going to do, but repelling it's another thing, clearly. And I think it was a real concern to see a couple of the batsmen's techniques, particularly against the short ball, be found out as badly as they were.
You're obviously not going to fix it completely, but how do you go about improving that aspect of New Zealand's batting in the 8 to 10 days you've got before the Boxing Day test?
Well, I think technically, from a physical sense, there's no doubt there's a bit of work to be done there with 3 or 4 of the batsmen in particular who just simply didn't look comfortable at all against the short delivery. But I guess the biggest issue is going to be the belief that the batsman can get through a Mitchell Stark spell unscathed, the belief that they can stay and hang around the crease for a good couple of sessions and pick up their 60 or 70 runs and contribute to a big New Zealand total. Belief is something can't be coached. You can't tell someone to believe you can do it. It's down to the individual. So I think there will be a lot of soul searching from those individuals, particularly in the top 6, to really get themselves mentally strong and ready for what will be a very stern test in Melbourne.
A lot of talk about Jeet Raval even before this test, 2 failures in Perth. What do you make about the security of his spot at the top of the order and perhaps the alternative options there?
Well, that's probably the issue, isn't it, is the second part of that question in terms of the alternative options for Raval. Clearly his place is on the line. His place was actually on the line before the first test of the summer. And when you looked at that squad they picked, the one concern around a batsman who was slightly out of form at that stage was Raval. Now he's completely out of form, so it's got worse, and there's still no top order batting cover. The one choice is to keep Raval there, but clearly his mental capacity to get himself confident and feeling positive about his game now must be stretched. It must be a concern. Do they mix and mingle and come up with a new combination that may mean playing Blundell as the keeper? Watling could go at the top of the order perhaps. Henry Nicholls has opened the batting for New Zealand in one-day international cricket. There's a few choices there which they might look at from a makeshift perspective, or do they bring someone outside the 15 into the squad? Well, there hasn't been any Plunket Shield 4-day cricket for some time, so none of the domestic players have been playing even 4-day cricket. They're now on a diet of white ball with the T20 competition you haven't just started, so it's questionable anyone from the domestic scene will be ready any more than a Raval or someone currently on tour in Australia be ready to play against the likes of Stark and Cummins. So the selectors, by not having that top order batting cover initially, have really backed themselves into a corner.
Former New Zealand captain and opening batsman Ken Rutherford there speaking with Clay Wilson about the Black Caps' big loss in the first test against Australia. A team of American scientists are searching for clues about how the environment is changing by studying coral cores. The coral, extracted from reefs in the South Pacific, is providing a timeline of climate change. Gillian Kitchener has more.
For these scientists, drilling deep into coral is part of a quest to better understand past and future climate trends. The reason? Paleoclimatologists wanted to study the growth rings inside the corals for clues on how much and how fast environmental conditions have changed over time.
And these long corals are, I think, quite remarkable archives of environmental change over the last 400 or 500 years.
Professor Braddock Lindsley and his team at New York's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory are leading the research.
Unlike trees around here, which grow in the summer and not in the winter and grow out, these corals are growing up, and they have annual rings in them, and then we can use those as a guide for sampling, and we can also get almost monthly resolution when we sample every millimeter. So it's a lot of lab work, but once you get the final product done, you have this remarkably detailed chronology of changes in water temperature and salinity, which you know the years of going back in time. And there aren't many marine archives that can do that.
Long samples of coral cores were removed from the tropical waters of American Samoa and elsewhere. Using drills in the lab, Lindsley's team pulverize small pieces and run geochemical analyses of the coral dust. Scientists say that as humans burn more fossil fuel, the biggest contributor to global warming, oceans absorb growing amounts of carbon dioxide.
And we know we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and methane. We're causing temperatures to go up, and we're acidifying the ocean. And we don't know what the outcome's going to be. It's a big mystery, and it could be pretty serious.
Some of Lindsley's recent studies on corals from the South Pacific island of Tonga suggest that increased seawater acidification could lead to a decline in coral growth rates. Unhealthy coral endangers the well-being of entire coral reefs, structures that protect land against flood damage from storms, provide habitat for marine species, and in turn support local fisheries.
And that was Gillian Kitchener reporting. And that's all we've got time for this evening. Don't forget, you can go online and check out all our stories from the show this evening, rnz.co.nz, or you can check out our Facebook page. And don't forget, the First Up team and Morning Report will be with you from the very early hours with all the latest news.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. A hospital spokesperson says many of the victims of last week's Whakaari White Island eruption have not yet woken up. The Prime Minister wants officials to advise her in the new year of immediate actions needed in relation to the eruption, with the WorkSafe inquiry expected to take a year. Cabinet has approved a $5 million fund for the impact of the volcanic eruption and recent severe flooding in Westland. And fraudster David Ross has been granted parole and will be released in February. He was sentenced to 10 years jail for running the country's biggest Ponzi scheme in 2013. Those are the headlines. Our next news at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
I don't think people are quite thinking about much apart from the election result, which obviously depends on your point of view, whether you're happy or the opposite.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
What's fantastic is that our visiting emergency medical teams are able to